The hum of fluorescent lights was a constant, dull ache behind my eyes. I traced the condensation on my lukewarm coffee cup, the plastic tasting faintly of stale disappointment. Another Tuesday. Another day spent in this cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing with a persistent, unanswered shrill that seemed to mark my own stagnant existence. My reflection in the dark computer screen showed a man worn thin, the sharp edges of ambition long since blunted by the relentless grind. Rent was due. My car was making that alarming clunking noise again. The promise of a better life felt like a cruel joke whispered in a language I'd forgotten. Then the letter arrived, thick cream-colored parchment, sealed with a wax crest I'd never seen before. It spoke of a distant relative, a Great Aunt Elara, whose name was as foreign to me as the ornate script that detailed her passing and her will. The words swam before my eyes at first, a dizzying cascade of legalese and archaic phrasing. But the core of it, the part that made my breath hitch, was clear. I, Raj, was the sole heir to Blackwood Manor and the associated estate. The wealth it implied was considerable, enough to shatter the monotony to finally breathe. The solicitor's office was hushed, all polished wood and hushed tones. He was a man of precise movements, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his gaze never quite meeting mine. He explained the remoteness of the property, the extensive grounds, the peculiarities. He spoke of a caretaker, an old man named Silas, who had been with Elara for decades. He'd handle the transition, the solicitor assured me, his voice smooth as river stone. But there was a hesitation, a subtle shift in his posture when he mentioned the manor itself, as if the words themselves held a kind of dust that clung to the air. The drive out was long. The city, with its familiar cacophony and suffocating embrace, receded in my rearview mirror. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a rutted track barely wide enough for my sputtering sedan. Trees, ancient and gnarled, pressed in on either side, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something wild and untamed. I told myself it was just the countryside, the bracing purity of nature after weeks of recycled office air. But a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Blackwood Manor loomed at the end of the drive, not grand as I'd imagined, but sprawling and shadowed. It was less a house and more a collection of angles and eaves that seemed to absorb the fading light. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from the weathered stone. It was magnificent in a way that made my skin prickle. A place that had seen centuries, that held its secrets close. Silas was waiting for me on the porch. He was stooped, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the color of faded denim. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his calloused hands unlocking the heavy oak door. The air inside was thick, cool, and carried a faint, cloying perfume, like dried flowers left too long in a closed room. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that penetrated the gloom. My footsteps echoed unnervingly on the marble floor of the foyer. "Welcome, Mr. Raj," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "My Great Aunt Elara." He was fond of this place. Fond. It wasn't a gentle sigh, but a mournful cry, a sound that seemed to carry words I couldn't comprehend. I pulled the heavy quilt tighter, my breath catching in my throat. The house creaked and groaned around me, settling or perhaps shifting. The word fond felt inadequate, like describing a predator as merely interested. I walked further into the cavernous hall, my gaze sweeping over the dark, polished wood, the heavy tapestries depicting scenes I couldn't quite decipher in the dim light. A grand staircase curved upwards into shadow, the banister slick and cool beneath my tentative touch. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom, each one a tiny, ephemeral ghost. I told myself it was just an old house, settling. My first night was a tapestry of minor disturbances. The wind, I reasoned, moaned through the chimneys like a lost soul. A draft, I assured myself, rattled the leaded glass in the drawing room. But the persistent scratching, a sound like fingernails on dry wood emanating from within the walls, that was harder to dismiss. I found myself listening, straining to identify its origin, my breath catching in my throat with each rasp. I'd pause and it would pause. I'd move, and it would resume, always just beyond the next wall, just out of sight. The following morning, the air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic like old pennies. I'd left the windows shut, triple-checked them, yet a fine mist clung to the surfaces, beading on the chipped porcelain sink. The tap, when I turned it, sputtered a rusty brown before yielding clear water. I scrubbed at the sink, the gritty residue clinging stubbornly to the cloth. It felt like the house itself was weeping. My initial determination to catalog the mansion's contents, to begin the arduous task of assessing my inheritance, began to fray at the edges. I'd set up my laptop in the study, a room dominated by a vast, mahogany desk and shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes that smelled of mildew and forgotten lives. I'd tapped the casing of the laptop, my fingers trembling, praying it hadn't been corrupted by some unseen surge. It was always fine, of course, just an old house with old wiring, but the phone, the old rotary phone on the desk, a relic of a bygone era, began to ring. I'd jump, my hand flying to my chest, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I'd stare at it, willing it to stop, but it continued its digital shriek. Dead air, no dial tone, just an unnerving emptiness. I'd replace the receiver, my hand shaking, and moments later, it would ring again. This happened 3-4 times that afternoon. I started to see things, or thought I did, fleeting movements at the periphery of my vision, a flicker of movement in the dusty mirror above the fireplace, gone before I could focus. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and tell myself it was fatigue, the strain of being in this immense, desolate place. My mind, I reasoned, was playing tricks on me. It was the isolation, the sheer, overwhelming solitude. One evening, I was in the main hall, the fading light painting long, distorted shapes across the floor. It was too low to make out words, but the intent was clear. It was meant for me. I spun around, my eyes wide, scanning the empty space. Nothing, only the heavy velvet curtains hanging motionless, the portraits on the walls seeming to watch me with their painted eyes. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen presence. I retreated to the small, sparsely furnished room I'd claimed as my own. Locking the door behind me, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. I tried to rationalize. Old houses made noises, wind played tricks. My imagination was working overtime, but the feeling persisted, a deep, gnawing unease that settled in my gut. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what? The next day, I decided I needed to escape, even for a few hours. I needed to see other people, to hear the mundane chatter of the outside world. I drove into the nearest town, a small, forgotten place with a single main street and a faded sign that read Oakhaven. I found a small diner, the kind with worn vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee. I ordered a sandwich, my hands still unsteady as I held the menu. As I ate, I overheard a snippet of conversation from the next booth. "Heard old Mance is empty again," one voice grumbled. "Always is." The other replied, "No one stays long, not with what's in there." My fork clattered onto my plate. I tried to dismiss it, but the words lodged themselves in my mind. As I drove, the familiar, unsettling sensation returned, the feeling of being watched, of being known. Back at the mansion, I found myself drawn to a small, nondescript door tucked away at the end of a long, dim corridor. It was unlocked. Hesitantly, I pushed it open. A faint, metallic tang wafted up, stronger than before. I shone my phone's flashlight down, the beam swallowed by the inky blackness. It looked like some kind of service passage, leading to a place I hadn't yet explored, a place the will hadn't mentioned. What lay beneath the house, hidden from view. Later that evening, the phone on the study desk began to ring again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I snatched the receiver. "Hello?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. Then a faint, almost imperceptible rustling, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It seemed to come from the other end of the line. It was there, and it was waiting. Was this house truly alive, or was I losing my mind? The drive back felt longer than the drive there. Each mile was a slow crawl, the looming silhouette of the mansion against the bruised twilight sky growing larger, more defined. I gripped the steering wheel, my grip tight. "No one stays long." The caretaker's words echoed, a low hum beneath the engine's drone. It was just a turn of phrase, a grim warning for any potential buyer, I told myself, but it clung to me, a damp, suffocating shroud. When I finally pulled into the overgrown drive, the house seemed to sigh. A gust of wind, unnaturally cold for the season, rustled the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks flanking the property. They scraped against the stone, a sound like brittle fingernails on slate. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a cloying perfume that settled in my throat. I made my way to the study, the grand room that had drawn me here in the first place. The desk, a hulking beast of dark wood, was exactly as I'd left it. My notes, the cryptic passages from the will, lay spread out, illuminated by the single desk lamp. I picked up the heavy, embossed paper again. The true inheritance, it read, lies not in stone and mortar, but in what the stone conceals. What could it mean? I ran my finger over the faded ink, a tremor starting in my hand. Raj, I read, being ridiculous. It's an old house. Old houses have quirks. This one just has a lot of them. I spent the next few days trying to impose order, but it was like fighting a tide. The more I cleaned, the more the dust seemed to reappear, settling on surfaces I just polished. They weren't just at the edge of my hearing anymore. They slithered into my thoughts, insidious little darts of doubt. The isolation was the worst. The nearest town was miles away, and the single landline in the house, a relic from another era, crackled with static whenever I tried to dial out. My mobile phone, a sleek modern device, had no signal within the grounds. It was as if the mansion itself was a Faraday cage designed to keep the outside world at bay. One afternoon, while attempting to clear out a cluttered storeroom in the West Wing, I found a locked wooden chest. It was heavy, intricately carved, and smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, like old blood. I spent hours trying to pry it open, my frustration mounting. The lock was old, rusted, but resilient. As I wrestled with it, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. I was a child, maybe 7 or 8. I'd never seen those drawings again. The memory was so vivid, so raw. That tears pricked my eyes. The chest in front of me suddenly felt like that trunk, a symbol of every rejection, every failure. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal. I lay in the cavernous bedroom, the 4-poster bed feeling like a cage, and stared at the ceiling. The water stains, shaped like grotesque faces, seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight. I was about to drift into an uneasy sleep when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thudding. Coming from downstairs. My heart lurched. It was too regular to be the house settling, too deliberate. I sat up, straining my ears. Thud. It sounded like something heavy being dragged, slowly, painstakingly, across the marble floor of the grand hall. I swung my legs out of bed, my feet meeting the icy floorboards. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But a desperate curiosity, a need to understand what was happening in this accursed place, propelled me forward. I crept to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The thudding continued, a relentless, unnerving pulse. I opened the door a crack, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. The hallway was empty, silent save for the distant moan of the wind. Had I imagined it? Had the house finally driven me mad? Then a sound from the end of the hall. A faint, tinny, incessant ringing. One phone. Somewhere in the vastness of the mansion was ringing. It began to ring louder, insistent, demanding attention. I stood frozen, the metallic tang of fear sharp in my mouth. Why was a phone ringing in the dead of night? And why did it sound like it was coming from the direction of the sealed-off East Wing? The silence of the mansion pressed in on me, a physical weight. I'd spent days tracing damp patches on the walls, cataloging the strange, almost organic patterns in the rot. The will was vague, a riddle wrapped in parchment, hinting at a legacy that felt increasingly like a trap. But the promise of wealth, the sheer defiance of this decaying place, fueled a stubborn part of me. Raj, the inheritor, the reluctant investigator, I found myself drawn to the West Wing, a part of the house the solicitor had warned me to avoid. Structural integrity, he'd mumbled, his eyes darting towards the shadowed archway as if it were a gaping maw. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grime-caked windows. The scent of mildew and something else, something sharp and coppery, clung to everything. My footsteps echoed, each creak of the floorboards a gunshot in the stillness. I ran my hand along a mahogany desk, the wood slick with a sticky film. Beneath it, a shallow drawer resisted. I tugged harder, my knuckles scraping against the rough grain. It sprang open with a sudden, violent shudder. Inside, nestled amongst brittle, yellowed newspaper clippings, was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with a symbol I didn't recognize, a coiled serpent devouring its own tail. My heart gave a little lurch. This felt important. This felt like the answer I'd been searching for, or at least a piece of it. I sat on the dusty floor, the journal heavy in my lap. The pages were filled with a spidery, almost illegible script. The entries were dated decades, perhaps even a century prior. It demands attention, One passage read, the ink smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled. It craves a mind to occupy, a will to bend. This wasn't just a crumbling estate, it was a predator, and I was its latest prey. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the ramblings of a lonely old man. I flipped further into the journal, searching for a name, a clue, anything to anchor me. Then I found it. A single word scrawled in the margin of a page describing a recurring nightmare. Raj, my name. It was underlined, then underlined again, as if the writer had been trying to scream it off the page. My breath hitched. How could this be? The journal entries predated my existence by generations. Unless the house had a way of knowing, a way of reaching beyond time. The thought was absurd, terrifying. I slammed the journal shut, the sound unnervingly loud. I needed to get out of here. I needed to see another human face, hear another voice. I stumbled back towards the main hall, my mind a whirl of fear and a perverse fascination. I reached for the landline, my fingers fumbling for the dial. Static hissed, then a faint, distorted voice. It was the solicitor, his tone urgent. Raj, you must leave immediately. There's been a discovery, something about the property. It's not safe. Whatever you do not investigate further. Burn the journal, forget the will, just go. The line went dead. The solicitor's warning echoed in the vast emptiness of the mansion. Burn the journal, forget the will. But how could I? The word Raj burned itself into my mind. The serpent symbol seemed to writhe behind my eyelids. The house was a puzzle, and I was already too deeply entangled in its game. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, drifted from somewhere within its depths. And it was a sound that was now undeniably mine. Was this house truly alive, or was I losing my grip on reality? The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the walls. The silence after the call was a physical weight. It pressed against my eardrums, amplifying the frantic thrumming beneath my ribs. Burn the journal, forget the will. The solicitor's voice, usually a dry rustle of legal jargon, had been brittle, laced with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, or was it a desperate plea? My fingers traced the worn leather of the journal. The serpent symbol, embossed in faded gold, felt warm, almost alive under my touch. It was more than just ink and paper. It was a key, a map, a curse. The wealth promised in the will was a lure, a glistening bait in a trap that was slowly, inexorably closing around me. I stood in the cavernous hall, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet like old blood. Shadows clung to the high ceilings, shifting and coalescing into shapes that weren't quite there. But the solicitor's words gnawed at me. He knew this house wasn't just old. I needed to understand. The journal was my only link to the relative I'd never met, the architect of this elaborate, terrifying inheritance. Each entry was a puzzle piece, hinting at rituals, sacrifices, and a growing desperation. The language was archaic, the ink bleeding into the parchment in places, as if the writer had wept as they penned their secrets. My gaze fell on the grandfather clock in the corner. Its pendulum swung with a slow, deliberate tick. It had been stopped when I arrived, a frozen sentinel, but now it was moving, and the chimes, when they struck the hour, were not the resonant tones of brass and wood. They were a low, guttural groan, a sound that vibrated in my bones. I ran to the heavy oak door, the one that led to the outside, the one that always seemed to resist my efforts to open it. My hands fumbled with the iron bolt, slick with a greasy film. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself held its breath, its ancient timbers groaning in protest at my attempt to escape. I pushed, my shoulders slamming against the unyielding wood. Nothing. It was sealed shut, as if it had been welded from the other side. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Raj. It was my name, drawn out, distorted like a voice from the bottom of a well. My eyes darted around the hall. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. The portraits on the walls, stern faces from generations past, seemed to follow me with their painted eyes. Their gazes were not of judgment, but of anticipation, as if they were waiting for me to play my part. My steps carried me, almost against my will, towards the library. The door creaked open before I reached it, revealing rows upon rows of ancient tomes, their spines cracked and faded. The air within was even more stagnant, thick with the scent of decaying paper and something that reminded me of damp earth. In the center of the room, a single desk stood bathed in a faint, ethereal light, that seemed to emanate from the very air. On it lay a single, unbound page. It was a diagram, intricate lines, swirling symbols, and at its center a crude drawing of a house. My house. And surrounding it, like grasping tendrils, were more of the serpent symbols from the journal. It grows, it remembers. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the room, though the windows were all firmly shut. Books tumbled from shelves, pages fluttering like startled birds. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart and the low, steady growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I scrambled back, my hands scrabbling for purchase on the polished wood of the desk. The growl intensified, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the floorboards. It wasn't just a house. It was awake, and it was hungry. The grandfather clock's ticking had stopped. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a predator, and I was its prey. A faint, rhythmic scraping sound began coming from the floor above. Scrape, drag, drag. It was slow, deliberate, and getting closer. It was the sound of something heavy being moved, or perhaps of something being dragged. My gaze was drawn back to the grand staircase. It was too solid, too defined. It began to descend, each step accompanied by that unnerving scrape. It was coming for me, but what was it? And what did it want? Then the temperature plummeted. A mist, thick and cloying, began to seep from the cracks in the floorboards, smelling faintly of decay and something sickly sweet. I was trapped, and whatever was coming down the stairs was now in the hall with me. The scraping stopped. The air in the office was stale, a recycled blend of cheap coffee and desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of identical cubicles that formed the cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing. The relentless ring echoed in the confined space, a shrill, insistent sound that grated on Raj's nerves. He sat hunched over his keyboard, the screen a blinding rectangle in the dim light. His fingers, stained with ink from the journal, danced across the keys, but his mind was miles away, back in the suffocating embrace of the mansion. The solicitor's final words, a choked plea replayed in his head. "Don't go back there, Raj, for my own sake." He tried to leave. He'd packed a bag, his heart thumping with a desperate hope for escape. But the heavy oak door, the one leading to the outside world, had refused to budge. It was as if the house itself had grown roots, anchoring him to its decaying heart. He'd spent hours, then days, wrestling with it, his muscles burning, his spirit fraying. The journal, a forbidden inheritance, was his only companion, its cryptic entries a maddening puzzle. He'd spent sleepless nights poring over its brittle pages, the serpent symbol on its cover seeming to writhe under the dim lamplight. The will, promising immense wealth, now felt like a cruel jest, a lure designed to draw him into a trap from which there was no escape. He remembered the night the grandfather clock, frozen since his arrival, had begun to tick. The slow, deliberate tick-tock had been a comfort at first, a sign of life in the dead stillness. But then the chimes, not the resonant melody of brass and wood, but a low, guttural groan that vibrated in his very bones. He'd fled to the library, seeking answers in the dusty tomes, but the air there was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. A single, unbound page lay on the desk, a diagram of the mansion surrounded by grasping serpent symbols. "It feeds, it remembers." The words, scrawled in a shaky hand, confirmed his deepest fears. This was no ordinary house. It was a sentient entity, a predator that had been waiting for him. A sudden, violent gust of wind had swept through the library, though the windows were sealed shut. Books had tumbled from shelves, pages fluttering like trapped birds, and then the growl, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the floorboards. The house was awake. The ticking of the clock had stopped. He was trapped, and something was coming for him. The scraping sound had begun then from the floor above. Scrape, drag, slow, deliberate, and growing closer. His gaze had been drawn to the grand staircase. It was coming for him. He remembered the plummeting temperature, the mist that seeped from the floorboards, smelling of decay. And whatever was coming down the stairs was now in the hall with him. The ringing of the phone in the cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing jolted his back to the present. He stared at the receiver, his hand trembling as he reached for it. Who would be calling him here? In this impersonal purgatory of beige partitions and flickering lights, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that the answer to that ringing phone would only lead him further down the rabbit hole, deeper into the mansion's suffocating grasp. Should he answer it? The wood of the main door had splintered under my frantic assaults, the splintered edges sharp and unforgiving against my knuckles. Each blow, each desperate heave, only seemed to seal it tighter. It was a mockery, a cruel joke played by the very walls that had promised me fortune. I slumped against the unyielding oak, the rough grain biting into my shirt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Escape. The word felt like a phantom limb, an ache for something I could no longer grasp. Days blurred. The silence of the mansion pressed in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The usual creaks and groans of an old house had sharpened, taking on a deliberate, almost predatory quality. A floorboard would groan upstairs, a sound like a stifled cry. A draft would whisper through a room, carrying with it the phantom scent of decay, stronger than usual, and a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. I rationed the canned goods I'd brought, each can a small victory against the encroaching emptiness. I tried to keep my mind occupied, tracing the intricate patterns of the wallpaper, cataloging the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom. But my thoughts kept circling back to the will, to the vague promises of wealth, to the smiling, unfamiliar face of the distant relative whose name was etched on the parchment. What had I inherited truly? I needed to get out, not just from the house, but from this suffocating isolation. I remembered the old landline, tucked away in a dusty alcove off the main hall. It was a relic, I knew, but perhaps, just perhaps, it still worked. My fingers, still sore from my futile attempts at the door, fumbled with the receiver. The dial tone buzzed, a fragile lifeline. I punched in the numbers for the nearest town, a desperate, hopeful plea escaping my lips. Static, then a faint, tinny voice distorted as if speaking from the bottom of a well. "Hello?" a gruff voice crackled. "Yes, hello, this is Raj. I'm at the old Blackwood Manor and I think I need help." My voice trembled, betraying the composure I tried to project. "I'm trapped here." A pause, the static seemed to thicken. "Blackwood Manor? Nobody's lived there for 50 years, son. You sure you're not pulling my leg?" "No, I swear the doors are. They're locked from the inside." Another pause, longer this time. "Right, look, I'll send someone over, just hang tight." The line went dead. I sank back against the wall, clutching the receiver. Help was coming. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. I had fought. I had tried to escape, and now, finally, there was a tangible hope. I spent the next few hours in a state of heightened anticipation, pacing the dusty halls, my ears straining for the sound of an approaching vehicle. Then a new sound, faint at first, then growing, a rhythmic, insistent ringing. It wasn't the landline. It was coming from deeper within the house, from a part I hadn't yet fully explored, a wing that felt particularly. I followed the sound, my heart beginning to thud a heavy, uncertain rhythm against my ribs. It led me to a vast, cavernous space, once perhaps a grand ballroom, now a desolate expanse. It was a cubicle maze, ceiling tiles water-stained, one phone ringing. Rows upon rows of sterile, gray partitions stretched into the gloom, a mockery of modern office life transplanted into this decaying mansion. The air here was thick with a cloying, metallic odor, like old blood and stale coffee. The ringing phone, perched precariously on a chipped laminate desk, pulsed with an unnerving urgency, its shrill cry echoing in the vastness. It was a sound that spoke of unanswered calls, of urgent messages left unheard. I approached it slowly, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the grimy linoleum. Who would set up something like this here, and why? As I got closer, I saw the desk was littered with yellowed papers, their contents illegible in the dim light. The phone continued its relentless clamor. I reached for it, my hand hovering over the receiver. The house seemed to hold its breath. Abruptly, what had the phone been trying to tell me, and more importantly, who had been calling? The receiver felt slick in my palm, the dial tone a mocking hum after the disconnection. "Hang tight." The stranger's voice, calm and dismissive, echoed in the vast emptiness of the room. I was already hanging tight. I was strung out, taut as a wire, vibrating with a fear I couldn't articulate. The line was dead, but the house was alive, a low thrumming beneath my feet, a sighing in the walls that was too deliberate to be the wind. I stood in the center of the grand hall, the faded tapestry of a hunting scene seeming to writhe in my peripheral vision. The dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the grimy windows, each one a tiny, swirling phantom. My breath hitched. It was the quiet that was the worst. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of silence, thick and suffocating, It pressed in, stealing the air from my lungs, making my ears ring with the blood rushing through them. My gaze drifted to the heavy oak door, the one I'd tried to force open earlier. It stood impassive, a dark, unyielding sentinel. The stranger had promised help. A person would come, but when? The clock on the mantelpiece, its hands frozen at 3:15, offered no solace. Time here was a stagnant pool, refusing to flow. A creak. Not from the house settling, but something closer. My head snapped up. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing, just the frantic drumming of my own pulse against my ribs. My hands clenched, gripped tight, but the doors were sealed. The windows were barred or impossibly high. This place was a cage, and I was the only occupant. I retreated, my boots crunching on fallen plaster. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, each one a betrayal of my attempt at stealth. I found myself in the library, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and something else, something metallic like old blood. Books lined the walls, their spines cracked and faded, their pages brittle with age. Then a flicker, in the corner of my eye, a movement. I spun around. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. As I reached out, my fingers brushed against a loose panel. It gave way with a soft click, revealing a narrow opening. A crawl space. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This was it. A way out or a way deeper into whatever horror this house held. Hesitation warred with desperation. The stranger's words, "hang tight," felt like a cruel joke. I was alone, truly alone. The outside world, with its ordinary noises and solid reality, felt impossibly distant, a dream I'd once had. This was my reality now. I took a deep breath, the sweet rot filling my lungs. My hand trembled as I reached into the opening, my fingertips brushing against something rough and yielding. Cobwebs or something else. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, emanated from within. My muscles tensed, ready to bolt, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The scratching stopped. A new sound emerged, a low, guttural sigh that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the house. It was a sound of profound weariness, and yet an undeniable hunger. My eyes darted back to the library entrance. They were no longer mere absences of light, but active participants in the house's suffocating embrace. I peered back into the opening. My mind, already frayed, began to conjure images, fleeting glimpses of distorted faces, of grasping hands, of eyes that held no light. Were they real? My hand, still hovering at the entrance, began to shake uncontrollably. The cloying sweetness intensified, making me gag. I needed to know what was in there. I needed to escape, but every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, though I knew there was nowhere to run to. The scratching started again, closer this time, more insistent. It was accompanied by a soft, wet clicking sound, like insects scuttling. My skin crawled. I pulled my hand back, recoiling as if burned. I was trapped, not just by walls and locked doors, but by the house's insidious influence, by the way it twisted my senses, played with my mind. They were moving, shifting, taking form impossibly tall and gaunt, seemed to coalesce from the gloom. It didn't move, not outwardly, but I felt its awareness sharpen, focused solely on me. My breath shuddered out of me, a ragged gasp. And if so, what was it waiting for? The air in the cubicle maze, ceiling tiles, water-stained. One phone ringing was thick with the same cloying sweetness that had begun to permeate Blackwood Manor itself. It was the scent of decay, of things left too long to rot, but overlaid with something else, something almost floral, sickly sweet. My fingers traced the rough, peeling laminate of the desk, a desperate anchor in this shifting reality. The ringing persisted, a frantic, insistent pulse that felt less like a call and more like a siren's wail. It was coming from the furthest cubicle, a dark recess where shadows clung like damp velvet. I'd spent hours in this place, this echo of a life I no longer recognized. The stranger had promised a way out, a key, a weakness, but the only thing I'd found was more of the house. It had wormed its way into this sterile, forgotten corner, twisting the familiar into the grotesque. The water stains on the ceiling tiles formed leering faces now, their silent screams mirroring the ones trapped inside me. Each drip, a tiny, rhythmic torture. My breath hitched. The ringing stopped. Silence. I strained to hear anything over the frantic thump-thump-thump in my chest. The shuffling of my own feet on the worn carpet sounded like thunder. I had to move. The stranger's words, a ghost of a promise, urged me forward. Find the anchor, disrupt the pattern. What pattern? What anchor? The house was a labyrinth of my own unraveling, a mirror reflecting every failure, every regret. It fed on them. It was a hunger. I forced myself to stand, my knees protesting with a dull ache. The cubicle walls seemed to lean in, their beige surfaces rippling like disturbed water. My hand trembled as I reached for the partition. The laminate felt strangely warm, almost alive. I pushed it aside, and there it was. Not a thing, not an object, but a feeling. It emanated from the center of the cubicle, a knot of pure, unadulterated despair. It was the concentrated essence of every fear I'd ever tried to bury, every moment of weakness I'd ever experienced. And it was pulsing. I could see it now, not with my eyes, but with some deeper, more primal sense. It pulsed in time with my own racing heart, a macabre duet. The sickly sweet scent was strongest here, a cloying perfume of death. The stranger's voice, a faint whisper in my mind, repeated, "Disrupt the pattern." My mind raced. How do you disrupt a feeling? How do you break a pattern of pure emotion? I looked around the cramped space, my gaze snagging on a small, tarnished silver locket lying on the dusty floor. It was intricately engraved, a swirling pattern that seemed to echo the distortion in the air. It felt significant. Hesitantly, I knelt, my movements stiff and jerky. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. Images flashed behind my eyes, a child's weeping, a slammed door, a voice full of accusation. My past, my fears, this was it. The anchor, the source of the house's power over me. My hand closed around the locket. It was surprisingly heavy. The distortion in the air intensified, swirling faster, the sickly sweet scent overwhelming my senses. But this time it was different. The house wasn't just a passive observer, it was reacting. A low groan emanated from the very foundations, a sound of ancient, violated power. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, making it difficult to breathe. I squeezed the locket tighter, my grip tight. The fear was a tangible thing now, a suffocating blanket. But beneath it, a spark of defiance flickered. I wouldn't let it break me. I wouldn't let it consume me. The stranger had said disrupt. What if disrupting wasn't about destroying, but about changing, about reclaiming? My gaze fell on the locket again. The swirling engravings, they weren't random. They were a story. A story of loss, of betrayal, of a desperate longing for connection. A story that mirrored my own in ways I hadn't dared to admit. I held the locket up, the tarnished silver catching a phantom light. I focused all my will, all my determination on the object in my hand. I thought not of the fear it represented, but of the love it must have once held. I poured my own desperate longing for peace, for escape, into the cool metal. The groaning of the house intensified, rising to a shriek. The distortion in the air pulsed violently, like a dying heart. The scent of decay and sickly sweetness churned in my throat. Was this enough? Could a simple locket, imbued with my will, truly break the hold of something so ancient, so malevolent? Or was this just another trick, another turn of the screw in its endless torment? The walls of the cubicle began to shimmer, the water stains on the ceiling tiles elongating, twisting into impassably long, weeping figures. The phone, still silent, felt like a coiled serpent at my side. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Then a single piercing sound. It was a name, my name, spoken with a hunger that promised an eternity of suffering. What had I done? The locket. My fingers, trembling, closed around the cool metal. It was heavier than it looked, solid and dense. The swirling pattern on its surface seemed to writhe under my gaze, a visual echo of the disquiet that had settled deep in my bones. I'd been so focused on the feeling, the suffocating dread that clung to the air like damp rot, that I'd overlooked the tangible. It lay there, nestled in the dust, a small, dark secret. I pried it open. Inside, not a portrait, not a lock of hair, but a tiny, intricately folded piece of parchment. The script was faded, almost illegible, but I recognized the looping, spidery hand from the will. What did that even mean? I looked around the cramped space. The air, thick and heavy moments ago, now seemed too thin to breathe. Was this it? Had I broken it? A distant, tinny ring. Faint, muffled, it grew louder, insistent. A phone. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles protesting with a dull ache, and stumbled out of the room. The hallway stretched before me, familiar yet subtly wrong. The air still carried the faint, cloying scent of decay, but it was overlaid with something else now, a sterile, almost metallic tang. The ringing intensified. It was coming from further down the corridor, from the direction of what had once been the main office. I moved, drawn by the insistent sound, my footsteps echoing unnervingly on the bare floorboards. The house felt as if a great, unseen beast had exhaled its last, ragged breath. I reached the office door, which stood ajar. The ringing was deafening now, a frantic, desperate sound. I pushed the door open. The room was transformed. In their place was a sterile, brightly lit space. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare. The walls were painted a bland, institutional beige, and the air hummed with the low thrum of machinery. It was a cubicle maze. Rows upon rows of gray, utilitarian cubicles stretched out before me, their partitions forming a disorienting labyrinth. The ceiling tiles were water-stained, a sickly, mottled brown. And in the distance, one phone continued its relentless, maddening ring. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was not the house. This was something else, a fabrication, a memory. The will had promised wealth, a new life. It had also promised a cage. I stumbled forward, navigating the narrow aisles of the cubicle maze. Each step felt heavy, uncertain. The phone continued to ring, a siren song pulling me deeper into the artificial landscape. I reached the source of the ringing, a single gray cubicle identical to all the others. On the cheap laminate desk sat a black rotary phone, its receiver off the hook, the shrill sound emanating from its speaker. Beside it, a single unopened envelope addressed to me in the same spidery script. My hands shook as I picked it up. The paper felt strangely smooth, almost waxy. I tore it open. Inside, a single printed sheet. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a confession. It was a ledger, columns of names, dates, and figures. Each one felt like a tomb, a testament to a life spent waiting, hoping, trapped. Was this the wealth the will had spoken of? This sterile, silent monument to stagnation? The phone finally stopped ringing. It was absolute, profound. I was alone in the cubicle maze, the water-stained ceiling tiles pressing down on me, the bland beige walls closing in. I looked at the locket in my hand. To break the chain, one must forge a new one. Asterisk, I had opened the locket, I had found the message. I had stepped out of the manor's suffocating embrace. But what had I stepped into? Was this the resolution? Was this the new chain I was meant to forge? I clutched the locket, its cool metal a stark contrast to the clammy sweat on my palms. The house was gone, or at least its influence was. What was I supposed to do now? Where was I supposed to go?